There are some requests you can't refuse, even when they come from beyond the grave. My grandmother knew this when she made me promise, 3 days before she died, that I would go into her basement immediately after her funeral. Just me. Alone. And that I would open the blue trunk in the far corner, the one I'd walked past 1,000 times during my childhood without ever questioning what it contained. She was 94 years old, lying in a hospital bed we'd set up in her living room, her body finally giving out after years of stubborn refusal to slow down. I was sitting beside her, holding her thin hand, when she suddenly gripped my fingers with surprising strength and fixed me with those sharp gray eyes that had always seemed to see right through me. "Natalie," she said, her voice raspy but firm. "After the funeral, you need to go to the basement. The blue trunk. Open it. Read everything. Then decide what to do." I tried to ask her what was in the trunk, why it had to be me, why it couldn't wait. But she just shook her head, exhausted from the effort of speaking. "You'll understand when you see it. Promise me you'll do this. Promise me you won't let anyone stop you." I promised, of course. How could I not? She died 2 days later, peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by family members who told stories and held her hands and made sure she knew she was loved. The funeral was exactly what she'd wanted, a simple service at the church she'd attended for 70 years, followed by burial next to my grandfather who'd passed 15 years earlier. The house was full of relatives afterward, all of them eating casseroles and sharing memories, staying close because that's what families do when they've lost their matriarch. But I kept thinking about that blue trunk, about the intensity in my grandmother's eyes when she'd made me promise. As soon as I could slip away without being rude, I told my mother I needed to get something from the basement. "Want company?" she asked, but I shook my head, remembering my grandmother's instructions. Just me. Alone. The basement stairs creaked as they always had, announcing my descent into the cool dimness below. My grandmother's basement was cleaner than most, organized in that way that spoke of someone who'd lived through the Depression and never quite shook the habit of keeping things orderly and useful. Canned goods lined shelves along one wall, their dates written in her careful handwriting. Old furniture sat covered with sheets, waiting for someone to need it. And in the far corner, just where she'd said, was the blue trunk. It was bigger than I'd remembered, or maybe I'd just gotten used to seeing it and stopped really noticing. The trunk was made of metal, painted a faded blue that suggested it had once been vibrant. There were stickers on it, the kind travelers used to collect, showing cities and hotels and steamship lines. I'd never paid attention to them before, but now I noticed they were all European. Paris, London, Berlin, Prague. The trunk wasn't locked. I lifted the heavy lid and the smell that emerged was distinctly old, paper and fabric and time compressed together. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that crumbled at my touch, were stacks of documents, photographs, letters, and journals. On top was a sealed envelope with my name written on it in my grandmother's handwriting. I opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a letter dated a week before she died, written during one of her last good days. "My dearest Natalie," it began. "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you're standing in my basement wondering what on earth your crazy old grandmother has gotten you into. I'm sorry to burden you with this, but you're the only one I trust to understand, to handle this with the care it deserves. What you're about to discover will change how you see our family, how you understand our history. But I believe we've kept these secrets long enough. It's time for the truth." The letter went on to give me instructions. "Read everything in the trunk. Take my time. Don't rush to judgment. And then, when I was ready, decide whether the family should know." She was leaving that choice to me, she wrote, because she trusted my judgment, and because the secret had been kept for so long that a few more days or weeks wouldn't matter. I set the letter aside and began removing items from the trunk, laying them out on the basement floor where I could examine them properly. There were photographs first, black and white images from the 1940s showing a young woman who looked somewhat like my grandmother, but different in ways I couldn't quite articulate. The woman in these photos was more elegant, more sophisticated, dressed in the kind of clothes I'd never seen my grandmother wear. There were documents in multiple languages, some in English but many in German, French, and what I thought might be Polish. There were stamps and seals and signatures, official-looking papers that suggested bureaucracy and importance. And there were journals, several of them, filled with my grandmother's handwriting but younger, the letters formed more carefully than the shaky script I'd known in her later years. I picked up the first journal and began to read. The entries started in 1938, when my grandmother would have been 18 years old. But the girl writing these entries wasn't the grandmother I'd known. This girl lived in Vienna, in a wealthy neighborhood, the daughter of a successful banker. She wrote about parties and concerts, about studying art and literature, about a life of privilege and culture that bore no resemblance to the modest existence my grandmother had lived in small-town America. Her name in these entries wasn't even the same. She called herself Adele Morgenstern, not Ruth Williams, the name I'd known her by my entire life. And her family, the Morgensterns, were Jewish. I felt my breath catch as I realized what I was reading. My grandmother had been Jewish. She'd lived in Vienna in the years leading up to the Holocaust. And somehow she'd ended up here in rural Pennsylvania, with a different name and a past she'd never spoken about. I read through the journals methodically, watching the entries change from carefree accounts of a privileged youth to increasingly worried observations about the political situation. After Germany annexed Austria in 1938, the entries became frightened. Adele wrote about restrictions being imposed on Jewish families, about businesses being seized, about friends disappearing or fleeing the country. She wrote about her father desperately trying to get visas for the family, about how countries were closing their doors to Jewish refugees. There was a gap in the journals then, several months unaccounted for. When the entries resumed, everything had changed. Adele was alone, living in a small apartment in Prague, working as a secretary in an office that helped refugees. Her parents and her younger brother had been deported, she wrote in a shaking hand. She didn't know where. She'd only escaped because she'd been visiting friends in another city when the roundup happened. The entries from Prague were sparse, written by someone in survival mode. She documented her work helping other refugees, the constant fear of being discovered, the desperate attempts to secure passage out of Europe. And then, in March 1939, she wrote about meeting an American journalist named James Williams, who was covering the refugee crisis. The next several months of journals chronicled a whirlwind romance born of desperation and hope. James, my grandfather, was the foreign correspondent for a Philadelphia newspaper. He was kind, Adele wrote, and brave, using his position to help refugees when he could. They fell in love quickly, urgently, in the way people do when the world is falling apart around them. In June 1939, they married in a hasty ceremony at the American consulate. Adele's entry that day was short. I married James today. He's giving me his name, his protection, his country. I should be happy. I am grateful beyond words. But I can't stop thinking about my family, about whether I'll ever see them again. I'm leaving Europe as Ruth Williams, and I think Adele Morgenstern is dying here, in this city that's no longer safe for her. There were documents supporting all of this. Marriage certificates. A passport issued to Ruth Williams, née Morgenstern. Transit papers showing passage to America. And then, arriving in New York, documents showing name changes, social security applications, all the paperwork of building a new identity. The journals from America were different in tone. Ruth, as she now called herself, wrote about trying to adapt to a country that seemed impossibly foreign. She wrote about learning to be an American housewife, about suppressing her accent, about changing her mannerisms and her habits to fit in. James got a job at a newspaper in Pennsylvania, and they settled into a small house in the town where I'd grown up. She wrote about the guilt. Constantly, painfully, she wrote about the guilt of having survived, of living in safety and relative comfort while her family's fate remained unknown. She sent letter after letter to aid organizations, searching for any trace of her parents and brother. The responses, when they came, were filed carefully in the trunk. They were all variations on the same devastating theme. No record found, presumed deceased, lost in the camps. In 1946, she received confirmation that her parents had died in Auschwitz in 1942. Her brother had died in Dachau in 1943. The entries after that news were nearly illegible. Raw grief poured onto the page. She wrote about considering suicide, about not knowing how to keep living with the knowledge that she'd survived while they hadn't. But she was pregnant by then with my Uncle Robert, and James, my grandfather, had held her through her grief and convinced her that survival was not betrayal, that living and building a family was the best way to honor those who'd been lost. She never told anyone about her past. The journals made this decision explicit. In an entry from 1947, she wrote, "I've decided that Ruth Williams is who I am now. Adele Morgenstern died in Europe along with her family. If I speak about it, I'll have to relive it every day. People will see me as a survivor, a victim, a walking memorial to tragedy. I want to live forward, not backward. I want my children to grow up American, unburdened by horror they didn't experience. Is this wrong? I don't know. But it's what I can manage." And so she'd built a life on silence. She'd been a good wife, a devoted mother to my uncle and later to my mother, a pillar of the community who volunteered at church and baked cookies and attended every school play. She'd been, as far as anyone knew, Ruth Williams, the quiet wife of a newspaperman, with no past beyond her arrival in America as a young bride. But she'd kept everything. Every document, every photograph, every journal entry. She'd preserved Adele Morgenstern in this blue trunk, even as she lived as Ruth Williams. And now, 55 years after her arrival in America, she'd decided it was time for her secret to emerge. I spent 4 hours in that basement, reading through everything, crying more than once as I absorbed the magnitude of what my grandmother had experienced and hidden. Upstairs, I could hear the murmur of voices, relatives still gathered to mourn and remember. They were sharing stories about Ruth Williams, the woman they'd known. But none of them knew the truth. None of them knew about Adele. There were photographs in the trunk that broke my heart. A family portrait from 1937, showing a beautiful family in formal dress, no indication of the horror that awaited them. Casual snapshots of Adele as a teenager, laughing with friends, skating on a frozen pond, sitting in a cafe with books spread before her. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of how their story would end. And there were photographs from after, too. Ruth with James, visibly pregnant, standing in front of their first American house. Ruth holding my uncle as a baby, her smile genuine but with something haunted in her eyes. Ruth at my mother's college graduation, proud and loving and carrying secrets no one suspected. Near the bottom of the trunk, I found a collection of items that seemed to represent her old life. A mezuzah, the small case containing scripture that Jewish families affix to their doorposts. A menorah, tarnished but beautiful. A prayer book in Hebrew. And wrapped in cloth, a silver locket containing tiny photographs of her parents and brother. She'd kept these things but never displayed them, never used them, holding on to physical reminders of a faith and a family she couldn't openly acknowledge. There was one final letter in the trunk, this one not addressed to me. It was dated 1985, never sent, written to the International Tracing Service. In it, my grandmother requested information about 3 names: Hermann Morgenstern, Elise Morgenstern, and Benjamin Morgenstern. It was a form letter, polite and procedural, asking about relatives lost in the Holocaust. But she'd never mailed it. I could only guess that she'd written it during a moment of weakness or longing, then decided that reopening that wound after 40 years would be too painful. I finally emerged from the basement as evening was falling. The house was quieter now, most relatives having left, only my immediate family remaining. My mother was in the kitchen, washing dishes with my aunt. My uncle was in the living room with my father, looking through old photo albums. They all looked up when I appeared, probably wondering where I'd been for so long. I was carrying the blue trunk, struggling slightly with its weight. I set it down in the middle of the living room, and everyone turned to look at it, then at me. "There's something we need to talk about," I said. Something grandmother wanted us to know. The next few hours were intense. I showed them everything, walking them through the journals, the photographs, the documents. I watched my mother's face as she learned that her mother had been someone else entirely before becoming the woman who raised her. I saw my uncle struggle to integrate this new information with his memories of the quiet, conventional woman who'd been his mother. There were tears. There was shock. There was disbelief that had to be overcome with evidence. But there was also, eventually, understanding. My mother held the photograph of her grandparents, people she'd never known existed, and wept for the family she'd never met. My uncle read passages from the journals aloud, his voice breaking as he absorbed the magnitude of what his mother had survived and hidden. "Why didn't she tell us?" my mother asked, her voice small and hurt. "We could have helped her carry this. She didn't have to be alone with it." I thought about that, about my grandmother's choice to remain silent. "I think she was protecting you," I said. "She wanted you to have normal childhoods, to grow up without the shadow of the Holocaust hanging over you. And maybe she was protecting herself too. Maybe living as Ruth Williams, focusing on the present instead of the past, was the only way she could survive." We talked late into the night, examining every item in the trunk, piecing together a history we'd never known we had. We found details that made us laugh through our tears, like entries where young Adele complained about boring parties or annoying suitors, reminding us that before tragedy she'd been an ordinary teenager. We found moments of beauty too, like a pressed flower from what must have been her first date with my grandfather, preserved carefully between the pages of a journal. The question eventually arose: what should we do with this information? My grandmother had left that choice to me, but I felt it should be a family decision. Should we keep it private, as she had? Should we share it more widely? What did we owe to her memory, to the truth, to the relatives we'd never known? My uncle thought we should remain quiet about it, respecting my grandmother's choice to keep her past hidden. But my mother disagreed. "Mom kept this secret because she felt she had to, because she was afraid," she said. "But times have changed. Holocaust survivors are dying, and their stories are being lost. We owe it to her parents, to her brother, to acknowledge that they existed, that they mattered." We decided to take it slowly. First, we would research more thoroughly, using the documents my grandmother had preserved to learn everything we could about the Morgenstern family. We would try to find out exactly what happened to them, where they died, whether there were any other relatives who survived. Then we would decide about sharing the story more publicly. Over the following months, I became the family researcher, diving deep into archives and databases. I contacted the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, providing the information from my grandmother's documents. I learned that Hermann Morgenstern had been a respected banker in Vienna, that the family had been well regarded in their community. I found records of their deportation, the dates and places that confirmed what the letters had told us. I even found a brief mention of Adele herself in a document from the refugee organization where she'd worked in Prague, listed as a secretary who'd been noted for her dedication to helping others escape. I discovered that the Morgenstern family had been larger than just my grandmother's immediate relatives. There had been aunts, uncles, cousins, an entire extended family spread across Vienna and other parts of Austria. Most of them had perished. But I found one surviving cousin, now in her 90s, living in Tel Aviv. Her name was Sarah, and she'd been a child when her family fled to Palestine in 1938. Contacting Sarah was one of the most emotional experiences of my life. When I explained who I was, that I was Adele's granddaughter, there was a long silence on the phone. Then she began to cry. "Adele," she whispered. "We thought she died. We had no way to find her after the war. She just vanished." Sarah and I talked for hours that first call and many times after. She had photographs, stories, memories of the family from before the war. She told me about my great-grandparents, about what kind people they'd been, how they'd helped others in their community. She told me about Benjamin, my grandmother's brother, who'd been gentle and studious, who'd wanted to be a doctor. And she told me about Adele, the cousin she'd adored, who'd been smart and brave and full of dreams about the future. "She made it," Sarah said wonderingly. "She survived, and she built a life. I wish I'd known. I wish she'd reached out." I explained my grandmother's choice to hide her past, her need to move forward rather than backward. Sarah understood. "Survivors did what they needed to do to keep living," she said. There's no right or wrong way to survive trauma. Adele chose silence, and I chose to speak about it. Both choices are valid. My family decided to create a memorial. Not something public or grand, but something meaningful for us. We commissioned a stone marker to be placed beside my grandmother's grave, with both of her names, Ruth Williams, née Adele Morgenstern. Beneath that, we inscribed the names of her parents and brother, giving them a memorial in a country they never reached. At the unveiling, our entire family gathered. It was a small ceremony, just us and a few close friends. My mother spoke about learning this hidden history, about understanding her mother in a new way. My uncle read from one of the journals, a passage where young Adele wrote about her dreams for the future, dreams that had been interrupted but not entirely destroyed. I spoke too, about the responsibility of carrying these stories forward, about how my grandmother's silence didn't diminish her courage or her survival. I talked about how she'd lived two lives, one as Adele Morgenstern, a girl who'd lost everything, and one as Ruth Williams, a woman who'd built something new from ashes. Both were real. Both were her. We invited Sarah to visit, and she came the following spring. It was profound watching this elderly woman walk through my grandmother's house, touching things, remembering her cousin through the life she'd built. Sarah brought photographs and documents of her own, and we spent days combining our resources, building a more complete picture of the Morgenstern family. Sarah told us something that fundamentally changed how I understood my grandmother's choice. In their last conversation before Adele left Vienna, my great-grandmother had made her promise something. Live, she'd said. Whatever it takes, however you can, live. Don't let them steal your future along with your past. Build something beautiful, have a family, be happy. That's how you honor us. My grandmother had kept that promise. She'd lived, fully and completely, as Ruth Williams. She'd built something beautiful in a family that now extended to children and grandchildren who would never have existed if she'd given up. Her survival hadn't been betrayal but triumph. Her silence not denial but a form of protection, for herself and for us. The secret in that blue trunk changed our family's legacy. We went from being the Williams family, with a history that started in America, to being the Morgenstern-Williams family, with roots that extended back to Vienna and branches that reached to Israel. We learned about Jewish traditions and history that my grandmother had set aside but never forgotten. We connected with cousins in Israel and other relatives we'd never known existed, scattered across the world by history but bound together by blood. My mother started attending services at the synagogue in the nearest city, exploring a heritage she'd never known was hers. My uncle commissioned a family tree that included both sides of my grandmother's life, honoring everyone who came before. And I started recording all of this, preserving the story for future generations, making sure that the Morgensterns wouldn't be forgotten. We also donated copies of my grandmother's documents to the Holocaust Memorial Museum. Her journals and photographs became part of the permanent collection, available to researchers and students. The curator we worked with told us these personal accounts were invaluable, providing insight into the refugee experience and the process of building new lives after unimaginable loss. Looking back, I understand why my grandmother asked me specifically to open that trunk. I was the youngest adult grandchild, the one who would live longest with these stories, who would have the most time to ensure they weren't forgotten. She was passing not just information but responsibility, trusting me to handle her secret with care and wisdom. The revelation hasn't been without complications. Some relatives were upset that my grandmother hadn't trusted them with the truth. Others struggled with the implications of discovering Jewish heritage late in life, unsure what it meant for their identity. And there were difficult conversations about why she'd converted to Christianity, about whether that was a betrayal or simply another survival strategy in a time when being Jewish was dangerous. But mostly, the discovery brought us closer. We shared something profound now, an understanding of resilience and survival that ran deeper than casual family connections. We were the inheritors of a story that needed to be told, the descendants of people who'd fought to live, to preserve, to continue despite overwhelming horror. I think about my grandmother often, about the burden she carried alone for so many decades. I wish she could have known that we would have understood, that we would have held her story with the respect it deserved. But I also understand that she did what she needed to do, that her choice to live as Ruth Williams wasn't weakness but incredible strength. The secret inside that blue trunk didn't just change our legacy. It completed it. We understand now where we come from, what our family survived, what it cost to build the lives we're living. We honor both Adele and Ruth, the girl who lost everything and the woman who built something new, recognizing them as the same person navigating an impossible journey. My grandmother asked me to open the basement after her funeral, and I did. What I found there was painful and precious in equal measure. It was a gift, ultimately, this hidden history. It gave us depth and context, connected us to a larger story of human resilience and tragedy. And it reminded us that the people we think we know often contain multitudes, that everyone carries histories we can't see, that compassion and understanding matter more than judgment. Ruth Williams was my grandmother, the woman who made cookies and told stories and attended every school event. But she was also Adele Morgenstern, a girl who survived the Holocaust, who crossed an ocean to safety, who made the impossible choice to leave her past behind so she could build a future. Both versions are true. Both deserve to be remembered. And now, because she trusted me with her secret, both will be.